Sport, man, when you look at Richard Lee's early life, it's kind of wild. Because here's this guy growing up in a world where everything around him was about chasing success, chasing experiences, trying to squeeze as much juice out of life as possible. And he actually bought into that fully, like he was that dude who wanted to live loud, party hard, and always be in the center of whatever felt exciting at the time. And when you're in that mode, you don't really stop and ask yourself bigger questions, right? Because you're so locked into the cycle of working, making money, going out, traveling, showing off the lifestyle, sport. And it feels good for a while. It feels like you're on top of the world. But what's fascinating about Richard is that deep down, even though he had all this external energy and charisma, he was carrying this weird sense of something missing. Like he couldn't quite figure out why. With all the fun, all the people around him, all the new toys and distractions, there was still this emptiness that crept in whenever he was alone, and he didn't talk about it much, but it gnawed at him. Man, because you can only distract yourself for so long before your brain starts screaming at you with these late night questions. Like, what's the point of all this? Where is this all going? What happens when it ends? And Richard felt that, but didn't know where to park those thoughts. So he just drowned them out with more noise, more hangouts, more energy, because society rewards you for that, right? Being the guy who looks like he's got it all figured out, but in reality, he was like a dude wearing a mask, and that mask was cracking slowly, piece by piece, And the thing about Richard's lifestyle was that it looked glamorous on the outside, but on the inside it was chaos, like constant highs and lows, and he wasn't grounded, no anchor, no deeper purpose holding it all together. And that's the kind of life that eventually forces you into some kind of reckoning, because you keep patching over that void with another night out or another cool trip, And when I think about Richard back then, I see a man who was hustling through life like he was running a marathon without ever knowing where the finish line even was, And that right there sets the stage for everything that came next. So the crazy thing about Richard's struggles, man, is that they weren't the kind of struggles you see on the outside, like he wasn't broke. He wasn't sick, He wasn't some guy lost on the streets. He was doing fine by normal standards. But inside, dude, it was like a cage match every single day with his own mind, because when you've been living this life of constant noise and distraction, eventually the silence starts to scare the hell out of you, and Richard would talk about how the nights were the worst. Those quiet hours when everyone's gone and you're just left with your own thoughts. That's when the questions came creeping in, like this flood of doubt, guilt, confusion. Like, why am I here? What's the point? Is this all just random chaos? Is there something bigger than me? Or am I just wasting my breath until I die? And the problem was he didn't have the tools to deal with it. He didn't have a framework, so his brain was just spinning out, and he tried everything to kill that inner voice. More parties, more friends, more adventures, more gym time, more scrolling, but it never really went away. It just came back louder every time he tried to shut it down, and that messes with you, man. Because when you're successful on paper but miserable inside, you start to feel like a fraud, like you're wearing this mask that everyone applauds, but you're rotting behind it, and that contradiction was driving him nuts. And here's the other layer to it. He started feeling this weird guilt, Like he knew he was blessed with opportunities, health, money, friends, all of that, sport, but he felt ungrateful for not being happy, and that guilt stacked on top of the emptiness. So it's like double torture, Port, and people around him couldn't really see it because he didn't want to show weakness. So he just laughed it off, Port. But on the inside, it was a storm, and he'd lie awake thinking about death, about what comes after, Port, about whether there's justice for the good and evil in the world. And that stuff haunted him, Port. Because once you start thinking about it, you can't stop. And the more he searched for answers in his old lifestyle, Port, the more obvious it became that he wasn't going to find them there. And that tension, that inner war, Port, that's the kind of thing that either breaks you or pushes you to look for something way bigger than yourself. The wild thing about Richard's first exposure to Islam is that it didn't come in some dramatic movie style moment. It was almost casual, like life just kept throwing little breadcrumbs at him until he couldn't ignore it anymore. Sport. And it started with this one friend he had who was Muslim, a chill guy, not the type preaching at you or anything. Sport. Just grounded, calm, had this weird peace about him that Richard couldn't wrap his head around. Sport. Like when everyone else was losing their minds or stressing out, this dude stayed steady, and Richard, being curious, Port, would ask little questions, like why don't you drink? Why do you pray 5 times a day? What's with fasting, Port? And instead of giving him some heavy religious lecture, his friend just explained it in this simple, logical way, like, man, it's discipline, it's connection, it's purpose. And that started sparking something in Richard's head, Port. And then it snowballed, because once your curiosity is lit, you start noticing things you'd normally ignore, Port. Like he'd see a mosque while driving and wonder what goes on inside, or he'd scroll past a clip online of someone talking about Islam and actually stop to listen instead of swiping. Sport, and every time he got a little piece of it, it hit him differently, like it wasn't just religion in the traditional sense, Port. It was this full system, a way of life that seemed to answer those exact late night questions that had been torturing him, Port. And he couldn't shake that feeling, so he started reading here, and their articles, maybe a translation of the Quran, Port. And what blew his mind was how direct it felt, like it wasn't sugarcoating, it wasn't pandering, Port. It was just raw truth calling him out, and he felt like the words were literally speaking to him, Port, cutting right through the noise. And the more he explored, the more he realized wasn't about some blind faith, Port. It was about clarity, logic, purpose, like the puzzle pieces were finally clicking, Port. And what really stuck with him was how Muslims he met weren't perfect people, but they had this anchor, Port, like no matter how chaotic life got, they had somewhere to return, and that hit him hard, Sport, because that's exactly what he was missing, that anchor. And once you taste even a little bit of that stability, Port, it's almost impossible to go back to drifting aimlessly. So for Richard, Port, exposure to Islam wasn't some overnight conversion. It was this slow burn, Port. This series of encounters and realizations that started carving a new path in his brain, Port, one he couldn't unsee anymore. What's fascinating about Richard's curiosity phase is that it wasn't some straight line journey, Port. It was messy and human, like he'd get these waves of interest where he'd dive deep, then pull back, then go in again, Port. Almost like he was testing the waters of a new reality. And it all started with these late night rabbit holes, Sport. Scrolling through YouTube, watching debates, listening to people talk about Islam versus science, Islam versus philosophy, port. And every time he thought he'd catch it slipping, like maybe it wouldn't add up, it somehow just made more sense for it. And that blew his mind because he was used to things breaking down under scrutiny. But here, the deeper he went for it, the more it held up. And he remembered downloading a Kurd translation on his phone, thinking he'd skim it just to see what's in there, and then finding himself actually hooked. Port, like reading it at 2 in the morning and feeling like it was literally addressing him, port. And that's when he started bugging his Muslim friends with more questions, port. Not surface level stuff like why don't you eat pork, but real heavy questions like why are we here? Or what happens after death? Why does suffering exist? And instead of them dodging or fluffing the answers, port, they gave him this calm, grounded perspective that actually connected the dots. And it started changing how he viewed the world, like he'd walk outside and look at the sky or the trees and think, this can't just be random. There's too much order here. And then he got into podcasts, lectures, people explaining the philosophy behind prayer, the logic behind morality, and he realized this wasn't just religion for rituals, it was a blueprint for living. And he'd catch himself comparing it with his old life and noticing how empty his old patterns looked in comparison, And the wild part is he didn't announce it to anyone. He just kept learning quietly, scribbling notes, bookmarking videos, reflecting on verses, and every time he learned something new, it chipped away at that inner void, like he was slowly filling in this giant missing piece he had carried for years, and the curiosity turned into this hunger. This drive to keep going, because now it wasn't about debating or proving it wrong, it was about finding out how deep this well went, and the more he drank from it, the more alive he felt, like he was finally waking up from a long sleep he didn't even know he was in. The transformation for Richard was like watching a guy literally rewire his entire operating system, and it wasn't instant, it was gradual, but you could see the shift in his energy, like at first he was just dipping his toes in, praying here and there, trying to fast a day during Ramadan just to see what it felt like, and it hit him hard because those little practices weren't just rituals, they were like training his mind and body to slow down, to focus, to be present. And the craziest part was how it started bleeding into every area of his life. Like before, he was running on chaos, no sleep schedule, random habits, chasing highs, and suddenly he's waking up early for Fajr, He's structuring his day around prayer, and that gave him discipline he never had before, And he noticed how his temper changed, how the little stuff that used to set him off just didn't carry the same weight anymore, like there was this filter on his reactions. And even his friends started noticing, like, yo, why are you so calm? What's different about you? And he couldn't fully explain it. It was like this peace that settled in his chest, a peace he had never known. And what's wild is he also started letting go of old habits naturally, like he didn't feel the pull to drink or party the same way, not because someone told him not to, but because it just felt empty now compared to what he was experiencing. And he described it like leveling up in a video game, where suddenly the old levels just seemed boring and meaningless. And the more he embraced Islam, the more clarity he got, like his anxiety started fading, the questions that haunted him at night had answers now, not in some vague motivational way, but in a concrete, spiritual, logical framework that made sense. And it gave him a reason to push himself to be better, not for ego, not for flexing on anyone, sport, but because he felt accountable to something bigger. And you could see it in how he treated people with more patience, sport, more empathy, like he was finally aligned, finally connected to something real, sport. And that's the kind of transformation that people around him couldn't ignore because it wasn't fake, sport. It wasn't a phase. It was this deep shift from the inside out. And once that switch flipped, sport, there was no way he was going back to who he used to be. The moment Richard finally took his Shahada, man, sport, it was like watching this huge weight drop off his shoulders because he had been circling it for months, maybe even years, sport, battling that last bit of hesitation, wondering if he was ready, if people would judge him, if he could really live up to it, sport. And then one day it just clicked. He was sitting in the mosque, surrounded by a few brothers he had gotten close to, sport. And they told him, you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be sincere. And that line hit him like a punch, sport. So he stood there nervous as hell, repeating the words in Arabic, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, sport. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah. And the second he said it, sport, he described it like a rush of electricity through his body, goosebumps, heart pounding, sport, almost like the universe paused for a second and then restarted. But this time with him fully awake. And afterwards he just sat there, tears in his eyes, not even sure why he was crying, maybe relief, maybe joy, maybe the sense of finally finding what he had been searching for his whole life. And the days after were surreal, because life didn't magically become easy, but everything had a different flavor, like the same problems were there, but he wasn't alone with them anymore. He felt guided, anchored, connected, and he started building his new life brick by brick, praying consistently, learning Quran, hanging around people who uplifted him instead of dragging him down, and slowly the old Richard faded. The restless, empty guy, sport, and this new version stepped forward calmer, grounded, more intentional, and people around him couldn't ignore it. His family saw the glow in his face. His friends noticed he wasn't caught in the same toxic cycles. And even when challenges came, because they always do, he handled them differently, not with panic, but with patience, with trust. And that was the biggest shift, because before Islam, every struggle felt like a curse. But after Shahada, every struggle felt like a test with meaning. And that changes everything. Man, it changes how you see yourself, how you see life, how you see death. And Richard would say over and over again that for the first time in his life, he wasn't running anymore. He wasn't searching anymore. He had found home, and that home was Islam. So when you step back and look at Richard's whole journey, man, it's honestly insane, because you're talking about a guy who had everything on the surface, the lifestyle, the friends, the freedom, but none of it gave him what he was really looking for. And it took all those late night battles, all that inner chaos, all the questions that wouldn't leave him alone to push him towards something way bigger than himself, And that's where Islam came in, not as some random idea or trendy phase, but as a real living answer that filled the cracks nothing else could touch. And watching that transformation, from the restless dude chasing highs to the calm, grounded man standing tall after his Shahada, it's a reminder that people can change in the most radical and beautiful ways when they find truth. And that's not just Richard's story, that's a human story. That's a human story because all of us at some point are looking for that anchor, that meaning, that connection, and his path just shows what happens when you stop running from the questions and actually lean into them. Sport. So to everybody listening, good luck on your own journey. Whatever stage you're in, keep asking, keep searching. Sport. Don't be afraid of the silence, because sometimes that's exactly where you hear the answers. Sport. And thank you for sticking around to hear this story. It means a lot, Port, and I hope in some way it gives you something real to think about, maybe even something that changes you, Port. Because at the end of the day, sport, that's what stories like Richard's are for. Reminders that it's never too late to wake up and find your way home.